podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to 1865, the Nottingham Forest podcast. This is a podcast we didn't really want to have to do. We hadn't planned it, but we're recording on Tuesday, the 25th of July, and this is the day after we heard about the tragic deaths of Trevor Francis, age 69, and Chris Bart-Williams, age 49. So two players who have a connection to Forest, very deeply ingrained in their history, also well thought of at their other clubs. So we are going to have a little chat about the players and about their legacies. I'm joined by Maradona, the Midlands, and Adam. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off by talking about Trevor Francis. Now, I'll let you into a secret, listener. None of us are old enough to have seen Trevor Francis play in the red shirt of Nottingham Forest. So we thought we'd ask somebody who has. So I asked Zigger Zagger what he thought were his memories of Trevor Francis and what he thought his legacy would be as a Forest player.
Trevor Francis, I mean, what a player, what a signing. Not the sort of player we signed, too glamorous. If we were going to sign players from Birmingham, it was Kenny Burns and the likes of that, the sort of ne'er-do-wells and the waifs and strays. Trevor Francis was a big name, had been for a long time. Good-looking lad, very 70s, glamorous wife, had it all going on. Not really our sort of player, not really our sort of price tag. But then along he came, signed. Cloughie had his red rally jacket on and squash racket in hand, and I think sort of trying to play the whole thing down a bit. I think he made Francis turn up for some youth team games early on and do some sort of fairly menial stuff, very Clough. Didn't play in the European Cup run until the final because he wasn't allowed to. He'd signed too late, but obviously massive impact with that goal. What a moment for our club. That's the iconic moment in our club's history, that one, isn't it? That and Robbo's the year after. More of an impact the year after. Played all the rounds apart from the final, I think. Scored against Ajax in the semi-final and scored 2, if I remember rightly, against Dynamo Berlin in the quarter, so made a big contribution there. Things never really took off the year after, in a way. He went off to Man City, but yeah, it was the first time we felt like with Forest we've arrived. He was the player you wanted to be on the playground even before he played for Forest. We'd watched him on Star Soccer on a Sunday afternoon. Birmingham featured a lot in that. They were a good side then and very, very watchable, largely down to him. He was lightning quick. We all ran around on the playground with our school jumpers pulled down way over our hands because that was how he wore his shirts, long sleeve pulled right down. Great footballer, really nice guy, apparently. Always seemed very quiet and humble, and obviously an icon for our club.
Thank you once again to Zigger Zagger. We really appreciate you taking the time to record that for us. Maradona, the Midlands, we're not old enough to have seen Trevor Francis play for Forest, but we did catch his career as a player. And one of the things that's notable to me is that, you know, he was a player manager, a role that's fairly rare when we were growing up. And then he is probably thought of by Sheffield Wednesday fans as maybe their most fondly remembered manager from Sheffield Wednesday's glory years. What are your memories and thoughts about Trevor Francis?
Yeah, I mean, with somebody who's so famous in a Forest shirt, he provided the most iconic moment in an era of iconic moments, and you get that sort of almost false memory. You've seen it so often, so it feels like you almost have been there. I did watch it live, but I really first became aware of him sort of in the late 80s when he sort of came back from Italy to Glasgow Rangers. They had a whole load of English players up there: Chris Woods, Mark Haitley, I think Ray Wilkins even popped up for a bit. There's loads of Gary Stephen, Trevor Stephen. That wasn't confusing at all in those days. And then we after he sort of moved to Sheffield Wednesday, we had a classmate who was a big Sheffield Wednesday fan. So I think we probably took a more of an interest in Sheffield Wednesday just through what's known as banter these days. Back in those days, because we got the whole full Tricky Trev treatment in the late 80s, early 90s.
Tricky Trevor's Barmy Army.
Tricky Trevor's Barmy Army, yeah. So we probably had a more of a working knowledge of Sheffield Wednesday than either of us probably wanted at the time. But yeah, he even at that age, you didn't see much of other matches, other teams play, but the reputation was still there that he could come on and change the game, and he still had that sort of class about him. And that team he put together at Sheffield Wednesday at the time, obviously we didn't want to admit it, but they were a really good team. We were sort of staunch Forest supporters, and we were adamant that we were much better than Sheffield Wednesday at the time. But that team of Chris Waddle, David Hurst, and quite a big Nottingham connection there as well. In Nigel Pearson, and there's one or two others now that I can't remember. Viv Anderson. They were a really good team, and he really pushed them to really good heights, and to losing 2 cup finals in the same season to the gritty Arsenal team of George Graham. It was a great period for him and a great achievement.
Yeah, and of course, one of the things that's also worth remembering is that Tricky Trev signed Nigel Jemson from Forest. He also, if I remember rightly, was the man who took Chris Bart-Williams to Sheffield Wednesday, which we'll come back to later. Now, let's just remind ourselves of the facts. So Francis was English football's first £1 million player. Brian Clough was adamant it's £999,999, but apparently once you added in taxes and so on, it was just over £1 million. Signing him from Birmingham, where he'd created a reputation as being a terrific young pacey striker. He had to wait for his chance. It's a little bit slow going to start off with, but of course he made his mark when he scored that winning goal in the European Cup final to get Forest probably the most important moment of Forest history, to be perfectly honest. He had 52 England caps, and as we've just alluded to, he had a career as a player-manager at Queen's Park Rangers and Sheffield Wednesday. He had also played across in Italy with Sampdoria and Atalanta, and as Maradona said there, with Rangers in Scotland. After he hung up his boots, he also managed Birmingham and Crystal Palace. Of course, Birmingham, the club he had that really strong affinity with. Adam, I mean, that's a glittering career, and you saw from the reactions of the John McGoverns and Frank Clarks and Viv Andersons of this world just how highly thought of Trevor Francis was.
Yeah, and speaking from maybe the younger audience perspective, I think that, growing up as a Forest fan, surrounded by, Man United fans, Chelsea fans, Arsenal fans, whatever, it would always come back to the fact that, especially when you had Chelsea and Arsenal fans in the picture at the time when I was younger, that we'd won the European Cup twice. And, obviously Trevor Francis was a massive part of that with the goal that he scored. And as soon as that goal went in, he was forever etched in Forest history, no matter what he did after that in a Forest shirt. So, it was terribly sad news, and my dad rang me with the news, and he was really upset and choked up, and I think that a lot of Forest fans would have been the same. When a legend of your club dies, especially so young as well, it is truly sad news. But I think what the club have done is great. I mean, they've released the news, and then they said that they've got a book for everyone to go and sign that's in front of the Peter Taylor stand. So obviously any Forest fans listening to this that want to go down, I think it's there for a couple of days, until Wednesday, Thursday time. So the club have sort of reacted very quickly on that. But yeah, terribly sad news, and someone that no matter what happens in the future will probably always have the most famous moment in a Forest shirt.
And Maradona, I don't know if you saw John McGovern and Frank Clark talking yesterday. That was quite brave of them. They must have felt, we saw Viv Anderson on social media breaking the news, and it must have been a terrible shock, precisely because he's one of the younger members of that European Cup winning squad. So it must have been quite difficult in that sense for McGovern and Clark, as two of the senior players, to come to the realization that one of their younger colleagues and teammates is no longer with us.
Yeah, I mean that's sorry. That's what struck me when the news broke. It it wasn't somebody who I was expecting to go first. Really, he always looked fairly healthy. I know he'd had problems with his heart before, and that sort of does take a toll on you. But yeah, complete and utter shock. And sort of initially, when the news was sort of breaking on Viv Anderson's Instagram page, I think we were all hoping that it was a fake account or something, or it was somebody else. It was just news, and that it wasn't true. It was yeah. It's really strange to sort of comprehend sort of somebody who's such a legend in the history of the club not being there anymore, and one of the miracle men to go. We all knew the day was going to come when they started to pass away, but didn't think it would be him, and didn't think it'd be quite so soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And Frank Clark was saying that Trevor, he was he's quite professionally kept himself to himself in that sense, but Gary Birtles also did say that he was actually quite good friends with Trevor, and of course just recently they were both united in grief, having lost their wives to illness. I'm suspecting, Maradona, that was them being a member of the Strikers Club, both younger men in that squad, both being strikers. They probably had a little bit of a bond there, didn't they?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot that's been made about Trevor not necessarily being the most gregarious person, but his intelligence came over whenever he spoke. He wasn't your sort of typical footballer, and I think that's why he settled so well in Italy as well, and flourished there when so many other people, let's say Ian Rush, couldn't cope. But he had something more about him, and when he spoke, and he was so stylish as well. He always sort of had that sort of nice tan, always dressed but well, and he was those pictures of when he signed in the 70s. He just was a cool looking guy at the time. And so yeah, I think for Gary Birtles, it would have been a natural bond to have there with somebody like Trevor coming in. I think he spoke yesterday about thinking initially he was going to take his place, but once that's out of the window and he didn't necessarily take his place, I think it allowed them to be good friends.
Yeah. So naturally, we extend our sorrows to the family, the nearest and dearest of Trevor Francis. We extend our sympathies to the miracle men, for whom it must have been a terribly difficult day yesterday. And in just a minute, we're going to talk about another loss as we remember Chris Bart-Williams.
You're listening to 1865, the Nottingham Forest podcast.
Welcome back to 1865. We had some thoughts in the first half of this podcast about Trevor Francis. And Adam, if we were shocked after the news of Trevor Francis, it was nothing compared to how we all reacted when the news started to filter through, initially via Mark Crosley's social media, about Chris Bart-Williams.
Yeah, it will go down as just a truly awful day for the football club and for the families of Trevor Francis and Chris Bart-Williams. But look, I mean, it was really terrible news to get. He was at Forest for 7 years. He was at Forest for a long time. Couple of years before I started going in 2004. But even then, someone that I was fully aware of, someone that I had the pleasure of meeting when I was young, when I was a little kid. And everybody that's met him, everybody that's spoken to him or worked with him when he was in, obviously, Florida for the last couple of years, has said that he's just a truly lovely, amazing person that always wanted to help people get better. Obviously, that's why he was in coaching, and that's what he was doing out in Florida. And I'm sure he was, his typical smiley self right up until the end. But it was terrible news. And for that news to break on the same day as Trevor Francis as well, it compiled what was a truly awful day. Again, the club has paid tributes. But I think all we can say is obviously thoughts to his family, because it must have come to a shock to them. Obviously, we're not sure what's happened as of yet, but it really is sad news.
And just tell us about the time that you met him.
So it was It was when I was a lot younger. It was actually before I started going to Forest. So I was probably what, 3 or 4 years old. Um, and it was just like a player meeting. Really, obviously, my dad was a big Forest fan. Well, obviously still is. And, he's been a Forest fan since the 70s, 80s, and we used to always take me down to the when there were these club meet and greets. I think a lot of it was to do with the the junior Reds. I remember we got a Christmas card every year that was signed by Show with the Bear, and then but yeah, so we used to go down and meet obviously a lot of the players and stuff, and obviously I remember meeting Chris really fondly, and he was absolutely lovely to me then, and it's very vague memories. Obviously that was 21 years ago now, but even then it's people it has a lasting effect when you meet special people, and it was. I think it was more for my dad, but even then I was still 4 years old. But I mean, I went to start going to Forest a couple of years after, so it must have had some sort of lasting effect on me.
Maradona, we talked about the listeners will have worked out roughly what kind of age we are, and growing up watching football in the late 80s and early 90s, I kind of knew about Chris Bart-Williams. Was delighted when we signed him because I remember Sainton Greavesy banging on about him as a 16-year-old at Leyton, as a 15-year-old at Leyton Orient before he signed for Sheffield Wednesday. I think he was only 17 when he went to Leyton. When he went from Leyton Orient to Sheffield Wednesday, he was managed by Frank Clark at Leyton Orient and then signed by Trevor Francis. So there's a lot of connection here, but yeah, you're smiling at me as I mentioned Saints and Greavesy.
So I was going to make the exact same point, and I spent the afternoon searching Google for a clip of it to make sure I hadn't dreamt it. But yeah, he was like a wonderkind of English football. There's so much hype around him at the time, and as all the clubs were being linked with him after that Saints and Greavesy piece, up to Forest, Liverpool, all the big clubs, and then when he went to Sheffield Wednesday, I tried to get confirmation of this online again today, but I can't seem to get it. But I'm sure it was a British record transfer fee for a teenager at the time.
I think so. That rings a bell.
Yeah, but I haven't been able to confirm that. But yeah, he was a well-known guy, and it was just sort of very serendipitous of his being called Bart-Williams at the time. It was at the point where The Simpsons was getting huge in the country. There was the Bartman song being released. And it also stars all sort of aligned to help him become more and more famous. And then I can remember exactly when he joined as well. I was so excited because even at Sheffield Wednesday, he played sort of quite not every game. There's a bigger name players there like David Hurst and so on. But he was always someone I'd kept my eye on, and I always sort of secretly hoped we'd sign him at some point. And so when he actually came in that summer of '95 with Kevin Campbell, I was absolutely delighted.
And it's easy to forget he came for 2.5 million, I think it was, and I think he was only 21 still when he joined, but he'd been around for ages because of that prodigious nature of his career. For Sheffield Wednesday, he played in the FA Cup and League Cup finals that you alluded to earlier. He played in Europe, and then came for 2.5 million in 1995. It took him a little while to get started, but if we just skip ahead 1 minute. So Stuart Pearce was the captain and Colin Cooper was the captain, and then Bart-Williams got the captaincy. So in many ways, even though other players wore the armband in the interim, I actually think of Bartman as being somebody who was a proper leader figure when he had the armband, because it was only for a season or so, but he really kept Forest going, got hold of the games by scruff of the neck, asked by David Platt to play in pretty much every position on the pitch except a possibly left back and goalkeeper. And that season when Forest was struggling, but Bartman used his force of personality as well as his undoubted ability, I think that's the kind of thing that we will remember him fondly for, isn't it, Maradona?
Yeah, it's just such a sort of, he played football the way you wish you could play football. So he was skillful. He knew how to pass the ball. He scored goals. He thought intricate little tricks and things. A brilliant first touch. Anybody sort of growing up wanted to be that sort of player, and just that ability gave him the ability to control games, like you say, and play in any position. He really was a great player, and he didn't really get the recognition he maybe deserved on a national scale. Although he was sort of famous for being Chris Bart-Williams, I always felt that he never really got the recognition as for the ability he had. And again, when he left Forest, he didn't really sort of do great things after that. I thought he could maybe done a bit more because his career sort of petered out a bit, but which is a bit of a shame. But for Forest, it did take him a while to get going, but once he did, he was a real leader out there.
And Adam, I mean, we've all seen the clips. Clips have been going around of that kind of chest down and volley that he scored against Chelsea in the Premier League, which is a goal of the month contender, which was his first goal in a Forest shirt, if I remember rightly. He made 238 starts and 8 substitute appearances. He scored 35 goals. I say he captained the team for about a season and a half. And most famously, if we're talking about Trevor Francis's iconic goal in the European Cup final, Bartman scored his own iconic goal when, around the time that you were just in nappies, Bartman scored a goal in stoppage time against Reading that pretty much sealed Forest's return to the Premier League in 1998. A big game player, wasn't he, Adam?
Yeah, I think some people just relish the opportunity to play in big games as well. And, when you've got such a positive attitude and you play with such freedom, when you have these big games and stuff, they don't phase you in the same way they would phase other people. And I think that is something that he went and had throughout his career. He wasn't scared of playing the big games. When you come into senior football so young as well, you have to have a certain mentality to be able to handle that pressure or to handle that responsibility. And that's something that he could absolutely do. And, that moment, as I say, will probably be, again, a really important moment in our history. It's not obviously winning the European Cup, but it's the same time as in 20 years' time. I'm sure there'll be fans of my generation that will fondly remember Taiwo Awoni's goal against Arsenal that kept us in the Premier League. That's ultimately what football is about, isn't it? It's about memories. It's about how you felt when something happened. And I think a lot of people would remember him really fondly for that moment, along with his absolutely fantastic dance moves that if I tried to do after I scored a goal, I would look ridiculous. So fair play to him for that as well.
Maradona, I think I seem to remember. I mean, Baz would vouch for this. Baz was making the point in our group chat that he and I always used to joke that when Born Slippy, when Forest started using Born Slippy as their run-out song, that we were joking that Bartman was DJing in the tunnel waiting for the teams to come out. But he's a big character, wasn't he? And in an era where, dressing rooms were pretty kind of, you had to be a man's man to go in there. He went into that Forest dressing room as a young man, held his own, and then quickly became one of the senior players, didn't he? So it's a big character, and you could tell that, like when you saw him around and about. I remember driving through West Bridgford with my dad, and Bartman was behind us in his convertible BMW. You could just tell he's a big character. He's the one who revolutionized. He took over the stereo from Stuart Pearce, so it wasn't all punk music in the dressing room. Those kinds of figures are really, really important in a football club, aren't they, Maradona?
Yeah, and he was just a cool guy. I think for us being that particular age, where him and sort of players like Paul McGregor and Scott Gemmell were just a few years older than us. I mean, we were really attracted to those sort of guys and those sort of characters at the time. They were sort of living the life we wanted as sort of teenagers, looking up to them. And it was just that sort of coolness sort of came across and everything. And with the dance moves, that was going to be one of my memories. I was going to say the obvious memory is that goal against Reading, which I don't know if you remember, but my brother and I were immortalised forever. Was at the moment that goal was scored, because our photograph was taken just as he scored, and is used the next season for the season ticket leaflet. So we were immortalised in that moment. So we're all inextricably linked to that forever now. But the other memory was just those sort of the wiggly bottom dance moves with Kevin Campbell. Just great things. And I also remember when he started playing at Forest, we likened him to Tigger, the cartoon tiger, and it's just like there's a slight physical resemblance, but it's just his character. It's just like happy-go-lucky, bouncy character, and I think it just personified him in so well with that Tigger character.
And I mean, obviously, his death at the age of 49 comes as a real shock. I'm sure Baz won't mind me saying that there's only 3 weeks age difference between those two. I always remember how old Bartman is because he's the same age as Baz. It's reported that he had a massive heart attack. Bearing in mind that I don't know much about the guy's private life or anything, but he went on to obviously have a good coaching career doing youth academy stuff and everything. You'd have thought he'd be a healthy guy. He didn't drink when he was a player. Jason Lee was talking about that recently, saying that he and Scott Gemmell and Bartman were the only players in that dressing room who didn't drink, apparently. So that's a real. It just, I mean, it hits hard, doesn't it, when it's a player who's broadly speaking in your age group, who you grew up watching, who you idolized, who was the captain when you imagined being the captain of your own club.
I find it hard enough to believe that he was 49 because when he came over recently, he looked the same. He didn't look any older. So to think now that he's passed it's incomprehensible. I just can't believe it. It's really a hard one to take.
And Adam, we've had a message from Tom on social media, and he's shared this story about Bartman. He said that when Big Ron Atkinson took over at the end of Forest's last stint in the Premier League, Tom wrote a letter asking if they needed any help translating for the French players. And Tom went in. He spent a lot of time with the squad. I'm not going to name any names, but he said that quite a lot of the players and coaching staff were not very friendly. He names that Van Hooijdonk and Steve Stone were very nice, but he said that Bartman was the nicest one of all. He had time for everyone. He chatted with them. He was an absolute darling with the staff around the club, the cleaners, the cooks, the bus drivers, who were easily ignored by some of the big time Charlies. And he said he'd always say something lovely to him, accompany it with a smile, and like so many people on social media are reporting, people are saying that when they've met him, when they've come across him, Bartman was just a big-hearted individual as well as a big character. So once again, it doesn't quite seem real, does it? It doesn't seem fair that one of those guys, one of the good guys, isn't with us anymore.
No, not at all. I mean, obviously 49 again, it's no age, is it, really? And it does seem, they always say, don't they, it's always the best people, it's always the nice ones, and that I'm sure that will definitely be attributed to him. But I think every football club needs those sort of characters, and I think in modern day football, I think it's going away a little bit, and like the footballers nowadays maybe have this different sense of importance, and I'm sure there's loads of footballers that aren't like that at all, but when you get these stories, and I've been reading through Twitter and stuff and seeing people say, "Oh yeah, like I met him at when I went down to the City Ground and met him, and he was so nice. Like he signed my shirt, and he took a picture of me, and all this sort of stuff." And someone put a tweet up that made me smile a little bit. He said that if he only has one shirt a game, but if you could give like 4 or 5 shirts a game, he would have. If they get fined for chucking their shirt in the crowd, he'd take the fine every week. And, it's just nice. It's nice to see that. It's nice to hear that. And, there was a lot of people actually posting from that he'd coached them and all that sort of stuff over in the States, and said that he was just absolutely lovely. And I think sometimes when in football, it can be quite a toxic and, environment football can, especially the coaching at younger ages and stuff. And to have someone like that will put their arm around you and, be nice and sort of help you positively and all that sort of stuff. It's nice to hear those stories come out. And, like I know he's been the guest at the City Ground quite a few times as well. I'm sure he was at Hillsborough as well for Wednesday. And he's someone that will be very, very much missed by, I'm sure, both fan bases.
And just as an aside to that, back in those days, you had to pay for the printing by the number of letters and numbers you had put on. So when he was Bart-Williams 11, you didn't see many of those shirts around because it would have cost an absolute fortune. Maradona Midlands, just as a closing thought, I mean, obviously that team who got us to the UEFA Cup, who got us promoted back to the Premier League, who were united under the reign of Frank Clark and then Dave Bassett and then under David Platt, it must be incredibly hard hitting for them because they are, they're not old men. But also, what a terrible day yesterday must have been for Frank Clark. He'd just done the media rounds after hearing about the death of his teammate, and now a player who he brought through as a first team at the age of 15 and then took him to Forest as a multi-million-pound signing. What an awful, awful day.
Was it? It'll go down as a dark day in our history, and it just, I just don't. It's incomprehensible how both could happen on the same day, and it's just so sad. It's so sad.
And just on a, I'd like to also not ignore the fact that the sad news that started the day was at lunchtime when the death of George Alagai was announced. And this isn't a podcast about the news, but on a personal note, I'd like to just say that, that was sad enough without then getting the other bits of news coming through as a Forest supporter. We are going to leave it there. And I want to say a big thank you to Maradona Midlands, to Adam and to Zigger Zagger for their contributions in this podcast. As you're aware, we had part 1 of our Grant Holt interview, which was in your feeds on Monday this week. And of course, we have events have overtaken us. We're planning to release part 2 during the week, but we'll hold on to that for another couple of days while we digest this news. In the meantime, thanks for joining us.
Sports Social Podcast Network.